Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the first meeting of the UPSFF Working Group. This is the 2022-23 UPSFF Working Group. My name is Ryan Arori. I'm the Director of Budget and Finance at OSSE, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. And with me hosting the meeting are Patrice and Michelle from the DME. Do you want to quickly say hi?
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Yan. I am the Director of Budget and Performance Management for the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patrice Taylor. I am the Budget and Performance Management Analyst at the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education.
Great, thank you both. Patrice, could you go to the next slide for us? So this is our agenda for today. We'll start doing with welcome and introductions, and that'll give everyone a chance to make sure that their microphone is working. I'll have everyone introduce themselves in a second. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the UPSFF Working Group context, followed by an overview of the UPSFF. Then we're going to spend some time talking about focus areas that the working group will discuss over the course of our meeting series. Finally, there will be a public comment period at the end of the meeting before we discuss the next steps. So just real quick, webinar logistics. Everyone that is a member of the working group is a panelist in this meeting. That means that you can mute and unmute yourself. You can chime in at any time. There are a lot of people on the working group, so if you would like to, you can also use the raise your hand feature so that we can call on you. If you don't feel comfortable just jumping in and talking, that's totally fine. You can do the raise your hand feature. This is a public meeting, so it is open to anybody that wants to join. If someone from the public joins the meeting, they will appear as an attendee, and attendees cannot speak. They can't mute and unmute themselves. They also cannot chat into the group. But during the public comment period, if there is any member of the public that wants to say something, I will be able to unmute them during the public comment period and they can share their public comments. Members of the public can also send chat messages to the hosts, which would be me and Patrice and Michelle. What else? Panelists, you can also chat in the chat box over the course of the entire meeting. Just make sure that you are sending your chat message to the right place. Usually that means you should be sending your chat message to everyone, but in some cases, maybe you need to be sending a chat message to me or Patrice or Michelle, and you can do that. Just make sure that your chat message is going to the right place, because if you send it to someone that's not me and it needs to be me, then I won't be able to see it. So I think that is all of the logistical stuff. So let's do introductions. So Patrice, can you jump to the next slide, please? So first, these are the members of the working group that are from government agencies. So can we have everybody introduce themselves, and let's try to go in order. I don't think Jen has joined yet. Jeanette said she would not be able to join today's meeting. So first up, Alonzo, can you just quickly introduce yourself? And you're on mute, Alonzo.
I was trying to find the microphone. It's the thing is at the bottom. And I also do not see the chat ribbon here. Anyhow, my name is Alonso Montalvo. I'm the financial manager for the charter schools, and I've been doing this thing for more years than I remember now.
Thanks, Alonzo. Stephen Regis from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. I don't see him here yet. Michael, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, Ryan, thank you. Yeah, Mike Bayuk, Director of Finance with the PCSB. This is, I guess, my second round of UPSF working group.
Great, welcome back, Michael. And Drew.
Hi, everybody. I'm Drew Snyder. I manage policy and legislative affairs for PCSB, and hello to the people I know, and nice to meet you to the people I don't.
Great, thanks, Drew. Patrice, can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so here are all the people that are representing local education agencies. So let's see, who do we have? Alan, can you start us off?
Sure. Everybody, Alan Francois, the Director of School Finance for DC Public Schools. So we develop the school budgets on their behalf.
Great, thank you. I don't see Sharon in the list. Next up, Will. Will, I can't see if you are talking or not. Maybe you're not here, or are you on mute?
It looks like Will is here, so maybe he's
Okay.
having some issues coming off of mute.
Okay, that's fine. We'll skip over. Let's see. Lester Johnson, I don't see him on the attendee list right now, so we'll skip him. Allison.
Hi, good afternoon. Allison Rohde, DC Public Schools. I'm the Director of Budget Strategy here with the district.
Great, thanks, Allison. And next up, Justin.
Good afternoon, Justin Ridstrom, former director of Idea Public Charter School for the last 10 years, and now supporting E.L. Haynes and Washington Latin as interim CFO.
Great, thanks, Justin. And you should update the name in your WebEx profile because it says Justin IDEA.
Sorry, thank
you. That's all good. Next up, Nate.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Nate Schwartz, Managing Director of Finance at KIPP DC.
Great, thanks, Nate, and welcome. Jack McCarthy emailed and said he might be late to this meeting, so we can move on to Ashley. And Ashley, I apologize. I spelled your name wrong in this slide, so I'll fix that.
No worries. Good afternoon, everyone. Ashley Simpson Barrett. I lead research and policy work for Brea Public Charter School.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. Next is Raymond Whedon. I don't see Raymond in the list. So we can come back to him. Next up, Jonathan. Is Jonathan here? No, I don't see Jonathan in the list either. Next up, Kevin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Kevin Wenzel, Deputy Chief of Finance for DC Public Schools.
Thank you, Kevin. And Patrice, the last slide of attendees. So these are our, oh wait, hold on. Sorry, I think Jen is trying to get in. So let me just do that.
She's the 202 number, I think.
Got it, yeah. These are our public representatives, our education budget experts that are not working at government agencies and not working at LEAs. So let's kick it off with Josh.
Good afternoon, everyone. Josh Boots, Executive Director and Power K-12 nonprofit that supports schools with data analysis.
Great, thanks, Josh, and welcome. Next up is Abraham.
Hi, everyone. Abe Clayman. I work at the Federal City Council where I direct education initiatives. Also a ward 4 parent of a DCPS student.
Great, thanks for joining us, Abraham. Next up is Chelsea.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Coffin. I'm the Director of the Education Policy Initiative at the DC Policy Center.
Thank you, Chelsea. Next is Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Gile, State Director of Education Reform Now, DC. We're a nonprofit organization focusing on ensuring that we have a just and equitable education system. And we're highly invested in making sure our students get resource equity. And so excited to be here. Also, Ward 7 resident.
Great, thank you. And next up is Kubila.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Quabila Huddleston. I'm a senior policy analyst at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, where I primarily focus on pre-K-12 education, budget analysis, and advocacy.
Great, thank you. And Mary Levy next. Hey, Mary, I think you're on mute. Can you just make sure you're unmuted? I, I can unmute you actually. Does that work, Mary? Can you try to introduce yourself now? It's not working, Mary. I'm sorry. Okay, well, you try to figure out the mute issues and we can come back to you, okay? Next up is Kathy.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Kathy. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Kathy Riley. I'm the director of SHAPE, which is a Senior High Alliance DC Public Schools, Senior High Alliance of Parents, Principals, and Educators, and also the convener of C for DC and of the Word for Education Alliance. I've also been on this committee for more years than I can count right now.
Thanks, Kathy. Next up is Atima.
Hi, this is Atima. I work with Adapts. I'm a school finance manager there, and I oversee our DC region. Adapts works with about 55 to 60 charter schools in DC, providing financial management and data and HR services. This is my first year on this working group.
Great, thank you. Welcome. And next is Margie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Margie Yeager from Education for DC. We're a local philanthropic organization that supports both DCPS and public charter schools, and I'm the parent of 3 DCPS students as well.
Great, thank you. And I know a couple other people have joined. Jen, can you introduce yourself? Can't hear you, Jen, sorry. I know you're on your phone, so maybe you're having some phone issues. Is there anybody else that has joined that has not introduced themselves yet? You can unmute yourself.
I found the unmute button.
Oh, great.
I found the unmute button.
Great, Mary, I can hear you. Go ahead, introduce yourself.
Okay. I was the architect of the UPSFF when the whole thing started back in 1996, and I've been with it ever since.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary, and always glad to have you back on the working group. Did I miss anybody else or anybody joined late? Okay, great. We can go to the next slide.
I want to say Stephen is on the call now.
Oh, great. Stephen, can you just say hi and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. Excuse me. I'm Stephen Regis. I'm the budget officer at OSSE, Office of Superintendent of Education.
Great. Welcome, Stephen. Great. So why are we all here? The UPSFF working group is a group that's actually required to meet every 2 years per the DC code. So as part of the DC code, OSSE is tasked with developing a report to council on behalf of the mayor that reviews the UPSFF and includes recommendations for revisions to the formula. So there are 3 parts to this. One is a study of the costs in the for education in the district. 2 is including research in education and education finance. And the 3rd part is seeking public input solicited through a working group. So obviously that working group is this and why we are all meeting here today. So the responsibilities of the UPSFF working group is to provide input and develop recommendations regarding the revisions to the UPSFF. And you can jump to the next slide. The expectations for this group, and we will be meeting over the course of the next couple months to discuss the current UPSFF, identify focus areas in depth, which will be determined by working group members. We will develop recommendations to be included in the final report. And as a caveat to that, the group will attempt to come to a consensus on the recommendations that are included in the report, although dissenting views can be included in the final report as well. And finally, we will review the draft of the recommendations section of the report. We will review that draft and finalize that draft together. So just a couple of working group norms. We do ask that you try to attend all of the meetings. We know that that is not always possible. So if you can just let me, Patrice, and Michelle know if you won't be able to attend any meetings, that would be helpful for us. Please be respectful and allow all voices to be heard. There is a large group and we want to hear from everyone. So please make sure, give everyone the opportunity to speak. Anything else? I guess this is maybe something that we can open up to the working group if there's any norms or anything that you'd like to share as we kick this off and as we meet over the next couple months. And while you're thinking about that, you feel free to jump in at any time. But just for some housekeeping, I mentioned at the start of the meeting that these are public meetings, so they will be recorded. They will be posted to the OSSE website within 48 hours of the meeting. Patrice is also taking notes, so we will be able to share meeting notes with you all after the end of each meeting. And since this is a public meeting, anybody from the public is allowed to attend this meeting. We do have a 15-minute period at the end of the meeting for public comment for anyone that is not a member of the working group that wants to share anything related to the UPSFF or school finance will be able to do so during the public comment period. So before I go to the next slide, anybody had any norms or anything that they'd like to share?
This isn't really a norm, it's just a question. The last time I served on this group, it was in person, obviously, that was pre-pandemic. There were in-person meetings. Is the plan to be virtual the entire time?
Yes, the
Also,
plan is.
Will Henderson is here. No.
Can you say the second part? I missed that, Josh.
Will Henderson is also now on the call.
Oh, great. So yes, we will be doing all of these meetings virtually. We just think it's a lot easier for people to be able to attend when they are held virtually. Also, I don't even know if OSSE is allowing visitors to come in. I would have to check on that, but the plan for now is we have these set up to be virtual for this year, for all of our meetings. And yeah, for the people that have joined a little late, we do want to give you a chance to introduce yourselves. So yeah, if anybody joined, Jonathan, I see that you joined. Could you just quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Sorry to be late. Not used to WebEx, but I'll get it right next time. My name is Jonathan Weinstein. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Capital City Public Charter School. Thank you for letting me participate.
Yeah, great. And thanks. And welcome back, Jonathan. And I also see Lester Johnson.
Hi, Leicester Johnson.
Leicester, sorry about that, Leicester.
That's fine. Hi, everybody. I'm Leicester Johnson. I'm the CEO of Academy of Hope Adult Public Charter School, and I too need to learn how to find a password to get in. So, thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's been 2 years since I used the WebEx platform. We used this last time that we held the working group, so apologies if I messed up anything in sending out invitations, but you made it, so that's good. If you have any problems or anything, you can definitely let me know, and we can work out any technological issues over the course of the meeting. Will, I see you dropped a note in the chat. Do you want to come off mute and just quickly introduce yourself?
Hey there, folks. Thanks for having me. Will Henderson, Executive Director of Finance and Operations at Paul. Appreciate you pulling us all together. And I've got my camera off. I'm on PTO today, so I'm dressed like I'm on PTO. So I'm going to have my camera off.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Will. Patrice, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is my last slide before I kick it over to Michelle, but these are the dates for our meetings. Always on Thursdays. We will always be meeting from 3 to 5 until our last meeting where we just scheduled it for 1 hour, which is our meeting on January 5th. So I believe everyone should have invitations for all of these meetings on your calendar when I sent them out via WebEx. As we will always send you reminders that these meetings are coming up. So if it's not on your calendar, you can let me know and I'll make sure to send the invitation to you again. So with that, all of the logistics and introductions are done and I can turn it over to Michelle.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. So we want to shift gears now to talk a little bit about the content over our next couple of months together, and first start by just putting the UPSFF into context. Recognize that this will be fairly familiar for several of you all, particularly those who have participated in the working group in the past, but just want to ground us all in kind of the same baseline set of information and understanding so that we are all set to work together over the next couple of months. So wanted to start with just the UPSFF by definition, and then we'll talk a little bit about it in the context of the citywide budget, and then in practice, what the actual foundation and weights look like before we go into talking about the potential focus group areas. So the Uniform per Student Funding Formula, UPSFF, is used to develop the annual budgets for our local education agencies. So for DCPS and our charter LEAs, this was passed in 1995 and implementation began in 97. So this is intended to fund all of our traditional school and system operations for DCPS and the public charter LEAs, including instructional services, non-instructional facilities maintenance and operations, and administrative operations. The formula itself is based on both a foundation level as well as additional weights. So the foundation level is for every general education student, and the additional weights go to students intended to support the additional costs that may be associated with differentiated needs, such as differentiated needs by grade level, special education students, students with limited English proficiency, students who qualify for the at-risk status, which, as a reminder for folks, includes students experiencing homelessness, students receiving SNAP or TANF, students in the foster system, and then high school students who are over age. And the funding formula also provides funding for students who are receiving residential services and extended year services for special education students. And as a reminder, the UPSFF is not the only revenue stream or resource stream for our local education agencies. There is also federal funding, which has its own set of formulas and criteria and definitions, many of which are listed out on this page. And then there are also grant opportunities available for schools through local funding, many of which come through the Office of the State Superintendent for Education. And so there are multiple ways that schools are receiving resourcing. UPSFF is the one that we are focused on for the purposes of these conversations. And here you have a breakdown of the current weights within the UPSFF for this upcoming fiscal year. So for FY23, you'll see the foundation level is highlighted in blue. There is also a facilities allotment that charter schools receive. And then on the left-hand side is the grade level weights for the foundation. And then the middle and right columns provide the supplemental weights based on student characteristics. So you have special education in the middle column, then English language learners and at-risk students. I'll note that coming out of last UPSFF working group in 2020, the ELL weight was broken out into elementary and then secondary. So those that weight was separated for student populations. And then a high school overage weight was added as a supplement to the at-risk funding. So those both were implemented in FY22. And then in FY23, through the Budget Support Act, a 40% and 70% concentration weight for at-risk students was also added. So this provides additional per pupil funding in schools that serve concentrations of at-risk students greater than 40% and greater than 70% respectively. And you'll see those weights listed right here. I'll pause on this slide just in case there are any clarifying questions here, since this is kind of the fundamental structure of the UPSFF. Want to make sure there's no questions that we can clarify at this moment.
Just one thing that I would add, Michelle, is that obviously like the weights and the categories have changed over the years, and some of the significant changes that we've seen, like the addition of elementary and secondary EL weights, some of this high school or the at-risk stuff, are things that this working group has actually talked about before they were implemented. So I guess that's just to say that the working group does have a very important part of amending the way that the formula works.
Also, Michelle, just to remind that the CFO on a quarterly basis makes this information available to all the schools based on their enrollment.
Thank you, Alonzo. I'm seeing a few questions in the chat. Drew, yes, we do have the historic weights and numbers, and we can certainly share that with this group as some appendix information coming out of this meeting. Happy to share that with the group. And then Abe, let's come back to your timeline question, because I imagine we'll get to some of that when we start talking about the discussion topics we want to dive into. And then Jonathan, for limited English proficiency versus English language learners, for these purposes, I think they're used, I forget the term, definitionally the same.
I'll come off mute quick if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I think a quick one on hopefully quick on the 40 and 70% concentration supplement, just because they're new. Will those be trued up in some sort of way, similar to other pieces of the formula by the end of the year in Q4?
So no, the way that that's written in the code is that those payments are made based on the projections, the enrollment projections. So they do not get trued up based on the actual number of at-risk students that are like in the enrollment audit.
Thank
and
you.
that is brand new legislation. So this fiscal year will be the first time that this will be implemented.
Michelle, I just saw that Josh had one more question about how the weights interact with the foundation.
Josh, you want to come off mute? I'm not sure I fully understand your question. Just want to make sure before I respond.
Apologize if my audio is weird, but my question is, these weights aren't like additive. So a secondary ELL student who is over age, like there's multiple different weights that apply to that student. But in terms of the actual calculation of the dollars, those weights only are taken from the foundational level. They're not additive. So it's not like we're talking the foundational level plus the grade 9 through 12 calculated, then times 0.0.
That's correct. Yeah, you're not like multiplying on top of each other. It is, everything is multiplied against the foundation level. Good question. Abe, I see your hand up.
Oh, sorry, that's my question later.
Alrighty, so next just wanted to ground us in the context of the overall city budget. So this slide just shows a bit about the cycle that the city goes through in budget formulation process. So it starts in July, September timeframe with the development of what's called the current services funding level budget, the CSFL, which is a local representation of the cost of operating district budgets before taking into consideration policy decisions. So this is used to estimate how much it costs for an agency to continue its programs and operations into the following fiscal year and provides a starting point for agencies to develop their budgets with their maximum allowable ceiling request or mark. And then we move into the period of time where agencies are actually formulating their budgets. So taking into consideration the citywide strategic plan and following budget guidance from the mayor's office, agencies start formulating their budget requests, which they submit to the mayor's office in winter. And then the mayor's budget office goes through a series of analyses to understand agencies' budgets, budget requests, the implications on the city, and balancing the priorities and needs against the overall revenue forecast for the city. And then there's a series of budget presentations in the January through March timeframe that the mayor's budget office goes through with the mayor to review those policy decisions before submitting the budget, the finalized budget to council. And then council goes through a series of hearings in the March through June timeframe to review, make modifications to, and then approve the budget before it is submitted for congressional review in the summertime. And so this UPSFF working group is taking place in this fall timeframe as we are developing budgets in anticipation of then it going through the mayor's budget office and the mayor for submission to council. So this will inform FY24 budget formulation, is part of the recommendations that this group's work will inform. Great, and then finally putting it in context in terms of the actual numbers itself. So the local FY23 budget citywide was $10.9 billion. You'll see the bottom chunk of that, the public education system, was $3.1 billion. This includes the public school budgets as well as the rest of the education cluster agencies. So it includes the libraries, parks and recreation, the state superintendent's office, State Board of Education, Public Charter School Board, University of District of Columbia, et cetera. So within that 3.1 billion, 2.2 billion is the budget for public schools themselves. So for DC public schools and for our charter LEAs, that is funded through the UPSFF. So we take the enrollment projections and then multiply it by that per student allocation from the UPSFF by student category and group. So 2.2 billion of the 10.9 billion is what the UPSFF represents within the overall city budget. And I think it's important also as context as we think about the overall citywide set of resources. It is defined by the amount of revenue that the city has available. And so naturally, there are always trade-offs that need to be made. And so part of the work of this group is to think about those trade-offs within the context, both for the school system, but also citywide. And then the last piece that I just want to put on everyone's radar before we shift gears and start discussing the focus areas of the working group is that we do want to share for context that as part of the FY23 Budget Support Act, the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education will be conducting an adequacy study in 2023. So the objective of this study will be to do a holistic review of the structure and impact of the UPSFF and recommend changes to ensure that the funding formula is equitably distributing funds to LEAs based on the relative needs of students. So as I'm saying that, I'm sure you can imagine there are certainly a lot of overlaps between the working group's work and what the adequacy study will be working on. The adequacy study does have resources associated with it, so we'll be able to be much more holistic and take a much larger structural view at the UPSFF. And so we imagine the adequacy study will also be able to take into consideration some of these broader pieces of context, research, trends, both nationwide and in DC. So for example, taking into account macro shifts in our education landscape. For example, what nationwide we will all be experiencing the education system, which is the drawdown of federal relief dollars. What we are seeing in DC with the declining birth rates in the city, the possibility of a recession, the number of single-site LEAs, these are all things within our education landscape that as we think about per pupil funding, we imagine this study will be taken into consideration as it makes long-term recommendations. And then similarly, thinking about the multiple ways that schools staff and resource their buildings. So as I mentioned previously, there's not just UPSFF dollars, but also federal dollars, local grants, city-provided resources, and taking a look at what this means, again, for equitable resourcing across our LEAs. And then finally, the relationship between funding levels and long-term student growth and outcomes, particularly for our students with the greatest needs. So this is a much larger study, and wanted to share this because while there may be some topics that we feasibly cannot address in the working group itself, given time, data, and resources available between now and December, there is still this opportunity in 2023 as we start conducting this much larger study to examine some of those questions. And so want that to stay on the mind of this working group as we make recommendations for the next fiscal year, but also potentially for the adequacy study itself. I'll pause there as well in case there are any questions before we then dive into discussing possible focus areas for this working group over the next couple months.
There's one question that Josh put into the chat. School starts before October. Can you clarify which school year FY24 applies to? So the government fiscal year 2024 would apply to the 23-24 school year.
I had one question about the formulation process. It's my understanding this report goes to the mayor and then it goes to the council. Can you talk a little bit about what the follow-up to the recommendations is and what you expect that to look like?
Yeah, and I think I can take this one, and Michelle, you can jump into. The report is issued by, it's written by OSSE, issued to the council through the mayor, and it's due to the council at the end of January. So the actual document that gets shared out in January of 2023 is used to inform the budget formulation process that is happening at that time. So that is a little before the mayor releases her budget, which happens in March, and then council takes over in April, May, and June before they make their tweaks to the budget and finalize the budget in around June or July. So does that answer your question, or?
Oh, partially. This is my first one of these, so
Okay.
But is there does the council then say back to the group, here's why we did or didn't follow what you recommended, or does OSSE provide feedback on, these were the recommendations and this is what ended up happening? That's more what I'm wondering, what that looks like.
Yeah, I think historically, I don't think that there has been that exact level of response. But I know that the report is often referenced either by the mayor during her budget testimony or by stakeholders, many of whom are on this working group when they provide testimony about the budget to council as well.
Okay, thank you.
And then there were two questions about a couple questions about what the adequacy study will cover and how it complements with the UPSFF again. So the adequacy study will look holistically at the weights, Mary, to your question around whether it's going to look at special education and facilities. I think all of those, it's going to take a broad look at the entire formula. And then Josh, yeah, I think technology costs, particularly as we think again about like macro shifts to our education landscape and what has happened over the last year, I think it will naturally have to take that into consideration. I think how school spending has changed either in the short term or structurally is one of the questions that we're thinking about with the adequacy study. And then how it complements with the UPSFF. So we're working on two somewhat different timeframes, right? We'll have the UPSFF in time for FY24 budget formulation. The adequacy study will go from January 2023 to December 2023. And so this will inform more long-term budget formulation and changes to the UPSFF. So it would be in time, let's say, for FY25 and beyond changes to the funding formula.
I raised my hand, but I don't know if people see it. This is Quabila.
Oh, scrolling through trying to find. Go ahead.
I know like we're not focused on the adequacy study here, but just two questions. One, has the DME already selected like who's doing the study? Okay, and two, are you all planning on some sort of like similar public engagement process for that study?
Yes. So we are in the process of crafting the statement of work now in anticipation of awarding a contract in January. So there will be public engagement both as we are developing the SOW and building into the SOW a requirement that the contractor is engaging with the public in the formulation of the study. And folks should feel free to ask questions about the adequacy. So these two are very intertwined. So I do want folks to make sure they feel comfortable understanding distinctions and also what will and will not be addressed in one form versus the other.
Well, I'll ask another since I was in the last working group. So, in 2020, we finished that, working group, and there were like several recommendations that we didn't get to, right? Like there were things that 2020 study by Afton Partners looked at that as a group, we were just like, we don't know what to do with this. Do you know if there's any intention to kind of take some of that and like carry that into the new study, or is this just going to be like a brand new look?
I wouldn't say it's going to be brand new in that we'd be starting from scratch, right? I think part of the intent and goal would be that it is taking into account just like the historic ways that the funding formula has engaged with folks, both in terms of what folks have recommended, what has worked, what has not worked, et cetera. So I think all of those will be for sure inputs. Now, what that will look like practically of like, will it specifically be referencing those things? Hard to say at this point, but I think understanding the historic context of the UPSFF is a critical part of the adequacy study. Awesome. All right. So given all of that, we wanted to now open it up for discussion on the focus areas of this working group over the next couple of months. So again, we will be meeting between now and January. We anticipate our last few sessions in December and January will focus really on making sure that we are all aligned on the report recommendations itself. So we'll have about 4 or 5 sessions that we can, sessions that we can devote strongly to content, discussion, debate, etc. The first 2 are topics that we plan to cover, and I'll preview a little bit about how we will approach those. And then there are 2 other topics that we're putting here for consideration. We probably have enough time and space to cover one of them, but also if there is a different topic not listed here that is of interest for the majority of these folks, we'll open it up for that discussion right now as well. And to give some context on what we picked in the top 2, we are putting forward these topics with the consideration of many of the changes that have been made over the recent years, and with the resources and data that this group will have access to this year, knowing that unlike the 2020 study, we do not have access to a similarly externally conducted large body of work as a reference point for discussion. knowing also that we are coming, I don't want to say out of a pandemic, but we are coming out of a pandemic, and this is the first year that we will have park scores again, for example. And so I think data in general is slightly more limited. So for the first two focus areas, the first one, given over the last 2 years, the bucket of at-risk weights has expanded from one singular category of at-risk funding to now 4 weight categories of at-risk funding, a supplemental group of funding for overage high school students, a supplemental group of funding for schools with 40% higher concentration of at-risk students, and supplemental funding for schools with 70% concentration of at-risk students. We do want to open it up for discussion amongst this group of the implications of the multiple at-risk categories on different school types. So across sectors, across school sizes, across various school types, just understanding a bit about what are the implications of having these categories, either intended or unintended, so that as we continue to move forward, we are moving forward intentionally with the ways that we are providing funding to our students who meet the definition of at risk. And second, we would like to revisit the adult school weight to determine if the existing weight is sufficient, and whether the city should consider differentiating among adult student types for any reason. And for context on this, we are convening 2 sessions with adult schools this fall, in anticipation of the 2 adult school representatives we have on this call, bringing forward some of those perspectives collectively to this working group in late October, early November timeframe, but we can be flexible there as well. And then finally, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. 2 potential additional topics we're considering addressing. First is the drawdown of federal relief funds and bringing to this working group and for discussion, how is this being addressed nationwide? We know that this is not something that only DC is experiencing. This is something that all of our education systems are experiencing, and what strategies can and should DC leverage, knowing that the full absorption of the over $1.2 billion of education relief funding that the city's received is not feasible. What can and should we work on? And then 2, similar to revisiting the adult weight, potentially revisiting the weight for special education schools. So not for this one, referring to the schools that are defined as special education schools, whether there is a consideration there for the existing weight.
Could I ask a question? Excuse me.
Yes.
So does this mean that we're going to revisit the decisions that we made 2 years ago on at risk? I mean, we spent quite a bit of time, and then at the end, it went quickly, but that we haven't really seen it fully implemented yet. We're going to go back over all of that. And the other thing that so our focus is on what the actual weights are. That's what our recommendations are. So I'm curious at what's in the top versus, I mean, I thought we might look at something like the special education weight or the middle school weight. Those are things, or the facilities weight. Those are topics that have really risen to the top in the past. So I'm surprised to see that we're going to revisit at risk. And I'm surprised a little bit. I mean, I know we have to look at the adult learners, but we also have big problems within our K-12 in terms of special ed. And I know middle school has come up in particular. So I'm just surprised. And I'm asking about, are we going to revisit all the work we did 2 years ago?
I think on the multiple at-risk weights, I think now is when we are seeing all 4 of these weights in implementation. So I don't think it's necessarily revisiting the weights themselves, but understanding what the implications are of having multiple weights is one thing that I think we want to make sure we understand. I know the concentration one, for example, was something that the working group did not recommend, and that was implemented that was legislated this year. And so what does that mean now that schools are budgeting? Are there unintended consequences, implications, et cetera, that we should be taking into consideration or understanding better? And then I think the other piece is our alternative weight, for example, is tied to at-risk in high school. Should our concentration weights be tied to anything that as at-risk changes, the concentration weight should change by a certain percentage or proportionally, or are we staying flat with the 0.05 over time? I think there are some nuanced questions there that we could dive into and discuss, but open it up to other folks for reactions as well. I don't want to be the sole person responding here, as this is for the working group.
I think I'll jump in really quick, Michelle, if I may, and just say, as you guys have named, there's been a lot of change in the at-risk space. And as I think Kathy just named, part of the, a lot of the work that went into that, we want to make sure, both for LEA stability and our understanding and predictability about what to expect in years going forward, that while we may make recommendations, while this group may make recommendations about how to think about them, I don't know that we want to, I don't know that we want on the table removing some or changing them so drastically that we wouldn't have predictability from an LEA perspective on what to expect in years to come.
Thanks, Kevin.
I would just add that we just did it. Like we don't really know yet what effect it's going to have. I mean, I've seen it come out in high schools, but it's hard to tell right now because they just got it. So by December, I'm not sure how we'll tell what the effect was. It's a little soon.
I think I share that. Just trying to think about like when we say implications, like what data are we hoping to look at to try to make some of those like estimates? I just don't think we have that information. I know at least publicly, right? Like the concentration weight money is not reflected in school budget documents, right? So not sure that we could do this with the fidelity that we want to do it without having that data.
Ashley?
I also wanted to comment on the at-risk conversation, recognizing that some of these weights are still new and we might not have a lot of information at this time to think about revisions to them. But I wonder, and I know this is sort of tangential to the UPSFF, if there is the possibility of looking at the definition of at-risk and if any populations are excluded from that definition.
I would second that.
Yes, I agree with that as well.
And I know one of the recommendations from last time was to consider changing, suggesting different language for that risk weight. So if that could be part of this bucket for at-risk as well, that'd be great.
Kathy, I see your mouth moving. I'm not.
All right, I just want to add to what Kevin said, that we don't want to destabilize as we sort this all out. I think that's been on the table for a long time, both at the council and here, whether we got this right and whether that's even the right phrase. But it also has been kind of it's a big part of the budgets now. So changing the definition is a big thing. I'll just say that.
Or the name too. I mean, I think I understand the desire there, but as we strive to better explain all of our schools' budgets, I think transitioning between different names shouldn't be taken lightly. It would be a big undertaking for us to implement.
I guess I'm partly asking, why did this rise to the top compared to the special education weight or other things that we've talked about, other things? Or I'm curious what other people think this is at the top, the at-risk weight and the adult learners, is that at everybody's top of what we want to do? Because this only meets every 2 years. Are those the most pressing issues for folks? Instead of, I know it came up a lot, did we have the levels right and the weights right for the special ed students that cross all sectors? So I'm just curious if other people, this was at their top.
Yeah, so I agree, but I think if I remember correctly with the last working group is that the at-risk weight, and I think was the summary was right, like we finally got to something that we could live with, if I remember correctly. And I think the most important part of that at-risk rate recommendation was the push for an updated adequacy study to really try to figure out like if what we were doing made sense and like where should things be in the right place. I think the trouble that we had, if I remember correctly, is that it just really wasn't clear. Like it wasn't clear like what based on the information we had, and we had some really good information like where it should be, what's the right thing, should we have these subgroup concentration weight, all that kind of stuff went into it. So I am, well, you know, the majority of the students that I serve in the neighborhoods that I live in are students fall into that category in terms of the funding source. Like I would definitely be more for folk looking at the special education in schools. The adult learners comes up year after year, 2 years after 2 years, however you want to name that. We really haven't named that. I don't understand the fiscal cliff, like how this group will influence any recommendations or next steps in terms of the fiscal cliff. But to me, the adult learners special education, we can always talk about at risk, but I do worry that because that topic is so meaty, that the same thing may happen again, that we get so into that we actually don't spend appropriate time on special education and adult learners and maybe some of the other topics that have been tossed around for the last couple of years.
And then what are those other topics?
I mean, I would say special education and adult learning comes up often, and we kind of like keep pushing it down the road.
And this is Leicester with Academy of Hope. I definitely think that adult learners, and I think adult learners could easily fall into an at-risk category when you look at least the definition right now of what classifies one as at risk. Adult learners in adult schools are absolutely in those categories. SNAP recipients, TANF recipients, and you know, if we're just looking at adult learner weights, the adequacy study, I mean, we've not had any review of where we are with the per pupil. And I just want to remind people, if folks aren't aware, adult schools do not get any of the other add-ons. So the ELLs or unless you're serving someone under 22. So the additional supports for learners who are identified as having learning differences are not included. And we only get the foundational weight, foundational funding for adult learners, and have similar expectations in terms of academic outcomes and the number of outcomes that K-12s do.
I'll just build off of what Leicester was saying to add that we also are trying to hire the same staff as K through 12 schools, and we need to be able to pay them competitive salaries to what our counterparts are paying in those schools.
So I think I'm hearing strong support for tackling adult. I know Kathy raised special education student weights. Curious, other folks' reactions to that, ways that we would kind of look at the information there.
Yeah, I definitely agree that looking at special education would make sense. And agree with a number of the comments that were made by the group around at risk. I know we very much appreciate some of the added funding that's coming in from the new weightings, but I agree that it's still early there. and that I wasn't in the last group, but I know some of my colleagues and the folks that are here that were in the last group, that was one that was covered fairly recently, as important as it obviously is. But special education for sure. As well, facilities, I think Kathy mentioned facilities in passing too. That's one that comes up, I know, quite a bit in our conversations internally, and I know it comes up generally as well. Is that something that would ever be discussed in this group, or is this not the right venue for that?
I think I heard someone starting to speak.
Maybe it was me. Yeah, I definitely think that facilities belongs. I am not sure it really belongs in a per pupil formula. We put it in when the formula started and it stayed there ever since. But facilities operating costs are not connected to enrollment as directly as instructional cost. And, it depends on the building as well as the students. And I did want to add that I agree on special ed and adults, and point out that a lot of the adult learners and the people who are seeking it but can't get in are parents of students in public education. And it's important to their children. And I love to see the example they're setting to their children. With special ed, it's not just the schools, it's the weights themselves. And we have no idea how those weights are set anymore. We know how they were set some years ago, but they've changed, and there's been no indication as to why. And unfortunately, when people look at funding, they tend to look at special education and throw their hands up because it's complicated.
I had one question about at risk. It seems like there's maybe some hesitation that Kathy identified around reevaluating what has already been done. Is that different though than thinking about additional buckets? I saw that the report from 2 years ago, the number one area for further exploration was adding different categories or new categories to at-risk. Things like parenting students or children of incarcerated parents, for example. And I'm not sure if that's captured by here, or if Kathy or if others have hesitation about exploring that, but that seems like something of interest.
It's fun. I think it's an interesting approach in a way. Like it makes me want to ask the question, are we adequately funding general ed? Like, why do all these things fall outside what we're doing for our students? Like, as we add more and more categories of students that need more, who's in the general ed category all of a sudden? Like, it's just, that would be an interesting thing. Like, why do all these needs come on top of? Like, maybe that's why special ed might be a good thing to look at. What's the definition there? That definition is those students need an IEP. We have people with 503s or whatever, but all of a sudden we have so many categories on top of general ed. Do we have the general ed right? Or is this an indication that we don't have the general ed right because we have to add so much on top?
And Kathy, can I just clarify with you, when you're talking about general ed, I just want to make sure you're talking about the different grade level weights and not the foundation level, right?
Right. I'm talking about, well, the foundation level is what it is. We can go there, but I am actually talking about the other weights. Like what we're talking about with at risk is essentially adding a whole nother category of weights onto the grade level weights. So once we went down the road of at risk, we were identifying that our grade level weights weren't adequate, and our special ed and ELL weights weren't adequate to the needs that we were seeing. So we've now added on for all of these things, which are important and are extra. I'm just questioning at what point do we revisit the grade level weights to see if we've actually got that right? And shouldn't we be serving some of these categories in the grade level weights? And if not, then the list of categories that we're not serving is very long.
Multiple things are one on the at-risk stuff, but that was really meant to be a proxy to make sure that the LEAs and schools that serve more of these students who are economically disadvantaged had more funds to solve it. And I'm not particularly interested in trying to find additional ways to classify at-risk students because we are still not fully funded adequately, not even optimally adequately funded the at-risk weight since we did that study in 2014. So like, it's hard for me to understand, like, do we need to be identifying more students as at risk, or do we actually just need to fully fund the at-risk weight and then study it? For students with disabilities, I know that I wonder just what is our capacity to do more research into this, because I know that we fund things by level. And I've heard from schools and those who serve these students that like it's really more about the disability and less about the level. And maybe not all the disabilities are applied to the right level. But then again, I think that that's a really robust study that we need to happen to really get a sense of like how much does it serve a student with multiple disabilities versus one who has just a level 1 type of a disability versus a level 4 disability. So, I mean, I think there might be data out there, but that seems like a really robust study and it's hard for us to accomplish between now and January.
So I think maybe not to answer that question, Josh, but just to maybe offer up some suggestions is we could, devote more time to looking at special education, like as a group, talking more about the costs for providing special education services. We could bring in experts in that field to share their body of work with us, and whether that's someone that maybe anybody in the working group could recommend. We have brought in people in past working group sessions to sort of like present information on that. We could also ask working group members to provide information about their own special education services that they're providing and costs. So like there's multiple ways to get more information. You're right. I think that like we could spend 2 years talking about special education itself. So for this working group and for the purpose of including something in a report, it might not be super detailed, but we can spend a significant amount of time on that topic if we want to.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of consensus around adult learners. So that's something we got to
Yes.
and
There's consensus.
and in my experience on this group with these 6 meetings and my experience over the years, it's hard. It's hard to cover anything well. And we often get to the end and we just say, let's just raise the funding. Let's recommend more money. And then we have to tack it on and we try to find consensus and it's rushed. And so that, I understand about the special ed. We could tackle a piece of something and not think we're going to get to the whole thing. We could tackle what is a level, what are the levels. We could start with the understanding that we're going to have to do that, and we could do adult learners. I mean, I am leery of doing the at-risk reconsideration now because we don't have the data to see how what we did is working. And to Josh's point, we might not be adequately funding what we've got. We've got the adequacy study coming. We already had one adequacy study. I'm trying to think of what can we get our arms around in this amount of time and make an actual recommendation that we all agree on that will best serve the students in all of our schools. Adult learners serves those schools. And once, beginning on special ed and looking at a piece of it and maybe making one recommendation around it would also cross all schools. But I'd be curious what other folks, what they think, how can we do this in this number of meetings?
I hate silence. I'm okay with, I think those two things make sense. I think Josh's statement though is still true. And so I wonder if there's a way when we just look at the last recommendations that we made, if there are clear things that had not been touched. So maybe it isn't that we're digging into these things like deeply, but we said, oh, and we need to, we recommend the same thing that we did in I don't know what the word, 2020, which if I remember correctly, may not remember correctly, I may be blending with other things, also mentions that that at-risk was not fully funded based on adequacy study. So, because what I would like to make sure is still in there is that we do believe that is something that's important. We do believe it's something that needs to be at the forefront of people's thinking, especially knowing that the study is going to be done again. I guess starting next December or however that works, next January plus January. I just think the more that we make sure that it is present is important, because while this group has people who have been on the original study, people who were in a study 2 years ago, policymakers are not necessarily as well versed, whether it is in the council or OSSE or whatever. And so we want to make sure that the things that are important are reoccurring, and that we see that they're important and they don't just disappear.
Thanks, Raymond. One thing that I do want to do is read some of the things that have been dropped in the chat, just so that we have them on the record, because I think when we publish these recordings, I don't think the chat follows the recording. So really quickly, I just want to go through and say some of these things out loud, because the list is getting longer and we haven't really been addressing them. So Jessica asked which recommendations were and were not accepted. So we actually have on our website the links to the past 3 working groups that have been in existence. So all of those reports with those recommendations are there. So first, I encourage everyone to skim through those, just so that you have some history of what we have already talked about. And then we can, sorry.
The question was really, I should say implemented.
Yeah. I was going to get to that part too. And then once we review, we can review those things that we've recently recommended and just point out which ones have been implemented or not. Some of them have been implemented. Some of them have been partially implemented. Some of them have not been implemented at all. So we can go through and look at that pretty easily. Mary had mentioned for adult learners, we need to differentiate full from part-time. On the fiscal cliff, we cannot study this unless the CFO relents and returns intra-district money to the LEA and other city agency budgets. We have no idea how much this is, let alone what it's spent on. Mary, do you want to explain that one a little bit? I'm not quite sure what you're talking about, but I just want to make sure that we're accurately reflecting that here for everyone.
This is a change that the CFO introduced to all city budgets. And when an agency like OSSE receives money from the Department of Education, or the Healthcare Finance Agency receives Medicaid reimbursement money from the federal government, it used to be that the amount of money that was to be allocated to the schools was shown in their budget. It is no longer. That's a new feature this year. It has been a big problem in budget review, because it's like tens of millions of dollars have disappeared from the budget. It's not that the agencies and the schools don't get the money, but that we have no idea how much it is. And it is for DCPS alone is tens of millions of dollars.
Got it. Okay, I understand what you're talking about.
That's so
Yeah,
the fiscal cliff is part of that.
Yes, sort of. But I do think that the money that is being intra-district between agencies is not UPSFF dollars.
Precisely, yes.
So it might be outside the scope of this working group when you're talking about the intra-district money, but I do understand what you're saying about money not looking like it's in the right agency place. So, okay,
Well,
thanks for clarifying that.
That's the fiscal cliff. That's the big fiscal cliff is the ESSER money, the COVID money.
Right.
And Mary, I'm dropping into the chat. OSSE actually recently published its recovery funds dashboard. You may have already seen it. If it is or is not getting at what you're speaking to, but it lays out all of the ESSER funds and the allocations towards specific LEAs. So that may be helpful in this conversation, recognizing that the way that things are reported in the budget book have changed this year.
Okay.
And real quick, I just want to go through the rest of the chat messages. Ashley said there isn't full-time and part-time for adult education according to the definition for what is required for adult education programs. There's full-time and more than full-time. Mary also said for special education schools, there are only 2 to my knowledge. There is no way to fund a school like St. Coletta with a formula and perhaps not with River Terrace. What else do we have here? Mary said, I'd rather look at facilities operating adequacy and different ways of funding it. So we already talked a little bit about that. Thanks, Mary. I think that getting the adult weight right is important. There is tremendous unmet need here. So I think we all agree on that. There's some more discussion about the fiscal cliff, whether the adequacy study is looking at the fiscal cliff. And then Josh mentioned, I'm not overly worried about the fiscal cliff. The federal government is likely to grant at least 1-year extension to utilize funds. That would be nice. I haven't heard that. Kevin agrees with Kathy on not touching at risk for this group, given the very recent changes. Leicester says, I do agree with the earlier comment that maybe we look at risk to see if any group is missing. Kubila said, I think we should be thinking about what do we hope to affect in FY24, because ultimately that's what we are tasked with doing. Michelle dropped in the link to the recovery funds on the OSSE website. One thing, Kubila, that I would mention is, like, since this is a 2-year, since we meet every 2 years, technically I would say that the working group report could influence FY24 and FY25. So just keep that in mind as we're, having discussions and making recommendations and stuff. And then finally, sorry, this is taking so long. Jonathan had mentioned the discussion touched on the regular need to ask for additional funding once we have discussed weights. To what extent is any discussion of increasing weights for any group solely a reallocation of funds away from other groups? If we believe adult or special education schools need more funds to serve their students, we should say that, but we should be clear if we are recommending a reallocation away from other categories. Yeah, I think this is an issue that regularly has come up for folks that have been on this working group before, where there is hesitation to recommend taking from one pot of money to add to another pot of money. So that's just something that we will have to keep in mind. I want to make sure I captured all of that correctly, and if anybody wants to clarify any of their comments, they can do so. Kathy, I see your hand is up.
As we talk about at risk, I did want to note that there is no definition, there is no menu of the way this money should be spent. So that part of what we run up against when we need to defend it is that it is supplementing, supplanting, often not supplementing, but also we don't know what strategies work. So the money is added to budgets and spent. It may or may not be spent on the students that have been identified. That is not part of what we recommended or the way it's implemented. And, I remember a couple, maybe 4 years ago, when we were in person, we tried to kind of look at Josh did a presentation, what kind of things have worked. But it is an issue for us that it's just extra money. And it doesn't go into any other bucket. Now, I'm not saying that these students don't need extra money, but because there's no long menu of what these funds might effectively do, it's not always clear that that money goes to those students in any LEA or at any school. So it is a caution about just adding groups without any sense of what the strategies are. And I'm not saying I know the strategies. This is really difficult. It's as difficult as talking about special ed or facilities.
Thanks, Kathy. And Kevin did add one more thing to the chat, that there will be additional reporting on at-risk in the new financial reporting standards, which are we're one
May
year
2024.
May 2024 is so they're coming, not as soon as maybe you would like, Kathy.
So to maybe close the book on at risk, since it sounds like there's varying opinions, but it seems like a caution towards proposing new categories or any fluctuation to the categories. I think to Josh's point around increasing funding, and then to I forget who said it, I think Jonathan's point similarly about additional versus trade-offs between funding. I think the one other question I'll pose to the group is whether it is valuable to look at, for example, for an incremental dollar to at-risk, which of the 4 at-risk categories that should go to. Now we know, for example, at-risk high school overage is, I believe, tied to the at-risk base of, if the at-risk base increases, the high school increases accordingly. The concentrations are not tied to anything. But whether it is valuable to have that discussion of incremental dollars being distributed within the at-risk, the 4 at-risk categories.
Michelle, this is Chelsea. I think we talked a little bit about this last time, and one thing we also discussed was multiple criteria. If they're kind of having a weight that way, that it wouldn't necessarily matter. Anyway, I think that's something that we discussed. And I think on the different, like adding different categories about risk, to me, it seems important to understand how those affect, if there are concentrations of certain student groups who are not getting picked up by the at-risk weight currently. For example, undocumented students may be concentrated at particular schools that don't have the at-risk funds, for example, versus kind of students that may be more distributed equally across all schools. And maybe each school is missing 5 of students or something from their at-risk count. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think we did talk last time about the different criteria, and I think it was one of the recommendations that didn't get picked up.
I think I may be thinking about it a little bit differently. So sorry if I'm not being super clear, but like if we said we had $100 to increase at-risk funding in general, should it go to the at-risk weight? Should it go to the high school overage weight? Should it go to the 40% concentration weight? Or should it go to the 70% concentration weight? Which maybe I'm just not understanding, but I think that's how I'm thinking about like what that conversation could look like. Now that we have if we assume we have these 4 categories set and we're not trying to change either definitions or buckets of funding, what are the ways that we are prioritizing between these 4 buckets, for example?
Michelle, again, I just don't see how we answer that question. Right? Because we're trying to decide, like, okay, if for every $100, like, or $1, for overage high school students, like, what is the benefit there versus like increasing it to the overall weight? Like, what data are we going to be looking at to determine that? If we're trying to like do that sort of analysis.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'd open up the group if we feel like there is information, maybe that there is not, particularly for the concentration weights, right? Because those have just been introduced.
Achievement data. And how each student is designated as at risk. So I would think OSSE could produce proficiency data by component of the at risk.
I'm not sure this answers the question you just posed, Michelle, but there's a pause, so I'll throw in an idea, sort of building off of what Chelsea was saying, that we know many immigrant or undocumented students and their families might not be, or their schools might not be receiving at-risk funds for them because they either don't qualify for those public benefits or for various reasons are choosing not to apply for them. And Chelsea and I have been having a side conversation about this, about something else, but I think it is topical here in that, and this is sort of what I was thinking when I was getting at, looking at the definition, because in DC we also have Alliance, which is another public benefit, and you have to be low income to receive that, but you don't have to be documented. And so I've always thought that that could be a great addition into the definition of at-risk status, is if you or your family are an Alliance recipient.
Yeah, if I may, I'm hearing some options of where there might be an expansion of the definition of at-risk weights, whether it's undocumented students or others. I'd be curious to hear from the group what other categories that are not defined as part of at-risk would be worthwhile to consider adding to that group.
We talked in the past about how on the prior working group, how qualifying for free and reduced meals captures students regardless of immigration status. And the difference in the number of students we have, for example, who qualify for free and reduced meals and who are considered at risk is hundreds out of 1,000 total students. So again, it's a proxy, it's not a separate category. I would be clear that trying to have a category of undocumented students is not feasible or workable or something we would want to do. So that's not necessarily a way to get to them, and we would need probably some sort of proxy.
Do I understand correctly, though, that the free and reduced lunch category is now very broad? Like some schools have a certain percentage and then they don't have to even say how many individually qualify. Like, aren't we adding a lot?
There are some schools that would qualify based on their census tract, and if they are in a particular category or location, they are considered 100% of their students receive free and reduced meals. That's different than the application process for free and reduced meals, which was used in the past year, for example, to qualify for the pandemic EBT program. Even if you were at a school where everyone qualified for a free meal, you wouldn't have qualified for the pandemic EBT program if you didn't submit a separate, unique application for the free and reduced meals program, unless you were qualifying under some other category. So there are schools that qualify en masse, but that doesn't mean that students couldn't apply individually if it was an indicator for some other category.
So each school would have to identify the students and have them fill out the paperwork I'm just, because I know community eligibility has made this very difficult. So I'm just wondering if you're saying at the schools where you do have so many students that qualify, that you're saying that at that school, if you needed one of that money, you need to have all those students individually fill that out.
I believe that would be the case, which is what schools that are not in those census tracts are doing now.
I don't know if it's a census tract, but anyway, somebody else might know more about this.
If a school is located in a neighborhood where a certain percentage of the population is below the poverty level, then the entire school may qualify for as a community eligible site, regardless of where the student is coming from, although it's typically an accurate way to reflect that.
So we don't want those students qualify as much as the students. Anyway, I'd be curious what other people have to say. Those students also then would qualify.
Yeah, I wasn't challenging whether students at other schools qualify, only that there's an undercounting at some other schools.
I understand.
I just want to point out, Jonathan, Kathy, there's a bit of an echo going on. So I don't know if it's coming from someone's mic.
All right, so it sounds like from this conversation, we have kind of closed the door on at risk, both from definitionally just the challenges of and instability of expanding the definition or messing with criteria themselves, strong consensus for adult learners, and then potential interest in special education students with recognition that this is a pretty challenging weight to cover over this period of time, but potentially there is a component of it that we could cover. And then not addressing fiscal cliff, for example, for now. Any other thoughts from folks?
The
Michelle?
silence is agreement.
No, well, I just was doing that notion. You said, Michelle, you said adult learners would be what we would focus on.
That's what I heard from the group. Yes.
Okay.
I like to ask a question that is kind of going around in my mind. What was the reason to ask the implications of having different funding categories? I see that the numbers, for instance, in the charter school sector, we have more than 67% of the population in the category of risk students. Right now, the contribution that we're making for all the categories is about $4,300. Are we proposing increasing the populations? Are we asking who has been left out? We already have identified 4 categories. Are there more to be identified and therefore more to be funded?
I think from this conversation, it's sounding like we do not want to open that for discussion and leave it with the categories and the definitions for now, recognizing some of the challenges of what it takes to navigate definitional changes. And then Josh, I think I saw a hand up. Maybe that disappeared.
The DCPS and many of the charters are spending a lot more on alumni services for high school students. What has been the the mayor's recommendation in terms of funding that work moving forward? Is it through the UPSFF or some other method?
Say the funding something services for high school students, graduation services,
Just the alumni services.
alumni services. Like career pathways work.
Oh yes, there's Pip through college. There's the DCPS. I forgot the name of, right? Like they continue to support students after they graduate. They graduate at least a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big chunk of that is like outside of the formula through grant opportunities with OSSE, for example, providing the grant opportunities for pathways type work within schools. And I think gets to some of the challenges of thinking about like programmatic weights versus student characteristic weights within the UPSFF.
I just want to pause here, Michelle, because we're running out of time, and I just want to make sure that the public comment period can happen if anybody from the public wants to make a comment. You can just like raise your hand or send me a chat message to let me know if you want to say anything. But we can keep the discussion going. Just wanted to make sure that we open it up to public comment if anybody had anything. And I'm not seeing anything yet, so we can continue.
Raise it is just a question for Michelle. The weights for there's a weight for high school. Is there a weight for middle school that's separate from a weight from elementary school?
Yeah, if you go back to yeah, on the left-hand side, Josh, I think this is what you're looking for. So there's the pre-K weights. Grades 1 through 5 have a weight, and then you can see 6 through 8 have a weight, and 9 through 12 have a weight. And then the only other there's the high school overage supplement at-risk weight.
And then secondary ELL, I believe Ryan covers 6 through 12.
You're putting me on the spot. I can't remember the grade.
Sorry, didn't mean to say Ryan. I was just thinking out loud myself. Covers 6 through 12. Period.
Kevin confirmed it is 6 through 12 that gets the secondary EL weight.
Josh, maybe to your point on the middle school, I think what came up is some concerns of where the students are when they get to high school, and if we could have prepared them better. So we gave that at the ELL, but many years ago, I remember we had some middle school principals speak to that the middle school weight might be hard. When you look at it, for I don't know if it's adequate for 1 through 5 and 6 through 8. But just to put that on the radar, that doesn't seem to be on the ticket for right now.
And if it were me able to advocate and push for that, I would want to have a discussion about the middle school weight, especially given the data that have come from our studies related to who's been most affected by the pandemic from an academic and social emotional perspective. It isn't for elementary school students who showed the largest drops in achievement on part, who are about to enter middle school, who might enter high school off track, and the number of students who are going to end up being over age in high school and using that supplement might grow substantially in the next few years. We'd rather prevent that so that they are coming into high school ready, prepared to be successful in 9th grade. I think we might need to have a conversation with our middle school principals as to what they're already seeing And I don't know that there are many middle school folks on this call. I know there's several really important high school voices here. I'm not sure about middle school.
Josh, this is Will Henderson. I can speak just briefly to middle school. But I think you're also, you supported us with some of the data as well. So I think some of the data you're looking at, you may be referencing some of Paul's data, but I think that, I want to just echo what you said. I think the hill or the hump to get over with our middle school is achievable, but we need the support to do that, the intervention to support to do that. So nothing more complex to say other than we're seeing some of the same things. It's more nuanced with our middle school. I think it's more straightforward with our high school.
And then to continue, like the most important factor for high school success is a student being on track for success for the year. But a lot of our students are coming in off track now, needing more pre-algebra just to even be successful in algebra. So again, I would love to, as part of this group, maybe bring in some middle school principals and educators to discuss what they're seeing at the middle school level and what things that they think will work, and to see if there is a reason why we might want to reconsider the weight for middle school.
And actually, another important voice would be those who serve ninth graders right from the beginning, because I think often those who receive the ninth graders understand the depth of the problem that was that they feel like they inherited from the issues in middle school. So I think our ninth grade academy feels deeply impacted from the gaps in the middle school experience when we can't do that ourselves.
I had one question to help inform this conversation, and I think Drew from PCSB mentioned something like this earlier. Do we have some information on how the weights have changed over the last almost 30 years, and maybe even how they were chosen in the first place?
Yeah, we can send out some information after this on the changes in weights and ideally like the trigger points for some of the changes.
And I could tell you where they came from to begin with.
Well, that'd be great.
I was there.
I might take you up on that.
Just let me know how you in what form you want to get that information.
I just want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak. If there's anyone that has been on the quiet side, we have 10 minutes left about, so just want to make sure everyone feels that they have the opportunity.
This is Jess. So if there's a decision to move forward with just studying adult funding and to the exclusion of a couple of other topics, I know people are very passionate and adamant about, adamant in discussing during this working group, I should say. Does that mean it gets, this is what happens next? Does that mean that it's just kind of like gets written as a couple of sentences at the bottom of the report for next time? I'm just curious, and this is why I asked the question earlier about which recommendations were implemented, because I just want to be conscious of topics that are very important being kicked to 2 years down the road just for them not to be picked up and then kicked 2 years down the road again. Probably for,
specific reasons, but I just want to be fully knowledgeable about what happens.
So I don't think that we are just limiting the discussion for the next couple months to be just adult education, if that's what you were sort of saying. I think that based on what I've been hearing today, there are other topics that people want to talk about. Like some people want to talk about at-risk a little bit. It sounds like there's conversations about looking at more of the grade level weights, in particular middle schools, special education and special education schools has also come up. So I think that we will be able to find time to talk about some of them in depth, maybe all of them not in depth. So it's not like our recommendation is just going to be something about adult schools. It sounds like we'll be able to talk about a lot more things. In terms of like how the next meetings are going to happen, I mean, Michelle, do you want to, we have next steps as the last 5 minutes. I don't know if you had anything specific that you wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think based on this conversation, it sounds like at a minimum, let's come back to this group and talk about, what some of the changes on the weights, right? We can send that information out and cover that in the next meeting, as well as a recap of last working group's recommendations and where things landed. And I think start the conversation around adult schools, right? I think if we spend the next 2 sessions, I would say covering the adult school topic, that gives us time to also think, and we can allot time during those conversations to continue this type of discussion on, all right, if we want to cover middle school, for example, what is the information that we need to gather between now and that point to be able to have that conversation? Or if we want to cover a portion of special education students, right, what would that be, and how would we want to gather the information to be able to have an informed discussion there? I think we can continue, maybe not with the same amount of time that we have for this session, but continue to hold some of that time, recognizing that things will evolve from session to session. That'd be my proposal. Curious reactions from the group there.
I think that makes sense.
Great. Well, for the sake of not painful silence for the next 9 minutes, our next meeting is October 6th from 3 to 5 p.m. We look forward to seeing everyone there. If between now and then you have additional thoughts, suggestions, feedback, recommendations, please feel free to reach out to us. I assume you have both Ryan and my emails, but I'm going to drop my email into the chat just in case. And we are happy to connect via email if there's anything additional on folks' minds. All right, thank you. Have a lovely Thursday.
Great. Thanks everyone for attending.